the statistics of the paper submissions. In total, we have 28 submissions, and among them, 7 have already been accepted at recent conferences. Therefore, we accepted them without peer review. The rest went through peer review, including 5 orals, 9 posters, and 7 rejections. For the oral papers, the award committee will watch the videos, attend the live Q&A session, and then decide the best paper and the runner-up. The audience can also post your best presentations at this short link. And Google and NVIDIA have kindly provided prizes for the best paper winners. And here is the updated schedule. And we have a great lineup of speakers. And something to note is there's a change in schedule.
Eugene, you have to share the screen.
Did I? Oh, sorry. Shall I start again?
It's just,
okay.
You can start with the page, yeah.
Right. So this is the updated schedule. And one thing to note is Sanya and Arun, there's a switch between them. And next, let me introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Philip Eisler. He is currently an assistant professor at MIT, and he has done many influential work, such as image-to-image translation and cyclogram. And every time I read his papers, I am inspired by the simplicity and the elegance. Now, let's give it to Philip.
Philip, you're on mute now.
Oh, okay, thanks. Thanks for the introduction, Jing. Okay, so let me start sharing my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. So I'm gonna talk about a kind of perspective I've been coming to, thinking of generative models as like data, but better. So this is really, I'm gonna talk about concepts that are familiar to a lot of us, but I'm putting it in a slightly different perspective. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, this kind of came about because when I've been teaching, I teach a computer vision class now, and when I try to teach generative models, a lot of students I think are initially confused because the way it works is a generative model takes some data and it learns to make more of the same. Ideally, it learns to make something that's identical to the training set. And it seems kind of weird. Why would you just want to make up, you already have data. Why do you want to make up new random images? And that's true, but I think that this property of generative models making data is just one piece of it. Making a random image is actually not the end all. What's interesting is that the data that you get, oops, something is, there we go. Okay, the data that you get is data with extra functionality. So you actually get an output, which is a generative model, which is a mapping from, in this case, it's an implicit generative model with latent variables. So generative models of that family are things like GANs and VAEs. We often, when we talk about generative models, usually this is what we mean these days. And we get an output, which is data with extra functionality. So what I mean by this is you could have a data point, like a picture of a volcano, and we could use that data for some purpose. Or we could have a sample from a generative model. And this is a data point which comes along with this latent variable z, which is the noise variable that generated that data point, and also this mapping function depicted by the arrow. That's the generator function g. And this data behaves a little bit differently than regular data. So one thing that you can do is this data ++ has the ability to wiggle around locally on the manifold of natural images. So if I change z very slightly, we've seen many demonstrations that this ends up changing the output image very slightly. And I can wiggle in multiple different directions. Okay, so the data points, the samples from a generative model, are augmented with this extra functionality. And that allows us to do a lot of really interesting things. We can think of them like data points, but augmented. And I'm calling this data ++. Okay. One more way to look at it is a generative model takes a data set, which is a bunch of discrete, unorganized points, and it fits some smooth, continuous distribution to those data points. And oftentimes that the resulting structure might be some kind of manifold or disentangled vector space with nice properties. So let's look at one thing that you can do with these data ++ points, these fancier data points. So one thing that you can do that you can't do with regular image data is you can interpolate between 2 points in a meaningful way. And the way this works is you have a mapping from your latent space z to your data space x. And if you draw a line in the latent space, you get a corresponding path in data space. And that corresponding path ends up kind of walking along the surface of the natural image manifold. Okay, so we've also seen a lot of demonstrations like this. Like this is Big GAN, where if I interpolate between the generative sample of this bluebird and the generative sample of this fly, I get this meaningful transition that looks like a half fly, half bird. It looks like something plausible. Okay, if I had done this just in pixel space, I would have gotten, you know, these kind of overlaid images that don't look realistic. Okay, so we can think of this data ++ stuff as data with extra functionality. Just to make it a concrete definition, we're gonna think of it as being this tuple of regular old data, X, that's like the images. But then for each image, we also have a latent code Z, the noise variable that generated the data. And we have the mapping G that goes from Z to X. And we might even have the inverse mapping that goes from X to Z. Sometimes that inverse mapping is called an encoder or a projection. And this kind of data, these kind of structures, you can do a lot of interesting things with that you couldn't do with just images X. We can do interpolation, which I just demonstrated. And we can also do interesting kinds of semantic and physical manipulations, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. You can also do interesting things like composition, where you take the data, you mask it somehow, and you add it to another data point masked in the opposite way, and you get something that looks like the composition of the two. And I'll show a demonstration of that as well. So we can kind of think of these as decorated data points with extra functionality. Just like in Python, you might add some decorator to your a class, and now it has extra functionality. And that extra functionality makes these points useful for graphics manipulation, for visualization, data augmentation. And what I'd like to suggest is whenever you have data, maybe you can try using this data ++ and do exactly the same stuff, and maybe it will work better. Okay. Any questions, by the way? It's fine to interrupt me in the middle. Or I'm not actually sure if people can unmute, but if you do, feel free to put a comment in chat. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few papers that we have done that are looking at aspects of this story. And the first is this paper that we put out in ICLR this year on the steerability of GANs. And this paper sought to ask, to what extent can we do meaningful manipulations of these data ++ objects? via simple vector arithmetic, via simple linear transformations. And this analysis was inspired by, maybe most of all, by Word2Vec. So Word2Vec famously showed that you can create a representation of words where vector arithmetic in the representation space is semantically meaningful. There is a past tense vector that takes walking to walked and swimming to swam in the representation space. And a lot of other people have remarked on this and noticed this in generative models as well. One example is in DCGAN. They had a sunglasses vector that they found. You could add a vector to the latent representation of an image, and it would add sunglasses to a face. So we wanted to study this a little bit more systematically and see to what extent we can create just the most basic manipulations that you can do in a graphics engine, for example. So camera transformations, lighting transformations. And this is the method that we came up with. It's a very simple method. We have our mapping from Z to X, latent space to image space. This is a GAN, but it would apply equally well to other generative models of this class with latent variables. And what you do is we're going to search for a direction, W, in latent space that will do a simple camera transformation, like pan the camera up or down. And the way we can perform that search is we can actually shift the training data up and down, and we can try to find a direction such that when we generate an image, after taking a step in that direction, it will match our edit operation that was defined using just Python code. Okay, so we have some edit operation, shifting the image up and down, changing the brightness, and we try to find a W vector such that G of Z plus W is the same as edit of G of Z. And we can take a step of length alpha. So this ends up working pretty well, and you can use this to find a lot of interesting directions in latent space. So just like there is a past tense vector in language models in Word2Vec, there is a zoom in vector in the latent space of Big GAN or Style GAN. So here are a few examples. We can zoom in and out on this cat. We can shift it back and forth. We can try to find a direction that will increase the brightness of an image, and that ends up making this kind of semantic transition of night to day. And on a volcano, it makes the volcano explode. So it kind of snaps to these semantic and physical priors. Okay, so that's really cool. And for today, I want to emphasize this perspective that these are like data points, but with all this extra functionality, right? So we can sample this cat face or this volcano, but now we have all these extra little functions that allow us to manipulate it locally. Okay, and I'll continue to kind of emphasize that point and show examples of how that's useful for analysis and visualization. I also want to mention that there's been a couple follow-up works recently which are able to find these meaningful semantic manipulations in latent space without supervision. So what we did is, in our work that I just showed you, is we had some supervision. We said that we want to find a direction that matches brightness or matches shifting the image up and down. But you could also say, I want to find a direction, I want to find a set of directions that are maximally distinguishable, and that's what's done on the left. Or I want to find a set of directions that correspond to the principal components in latent space, and that's what's done on the right. So these are kind of unsupervised methods of identifying meaningful directions in this latent space of the generative model. Okay, so these fancy data points can be manipulated, but what are the limitations? We wanted to investigate that too and see what that can tell us about the model and data bias. So one thing that you could do is we could just take this hot air balloon and try to translate it up or down. And as we increase the size of the translation, of the step size alpha, we observed a result like this. And it looks okay, but what you might notice is it kind of gets stuck. So if we plot this as, we think of it like a plot of position, well, it's a bit of a sigmoid curve. As soon as the hot air balloon comes to the boundaries of the image, it gets stuck. So why is that happening? And we saw that in a lot of different cases. If I zoom in on a cat, I can initially zoom in well, but then I make a big cat and I can't zoom in anymore, or I make a very small cat and I can't zoom out anymore. With rotation, oftentimes it completely failed. And we wanted to understand why there were these transformation limits. So we started looking back into the training data. This is trained on ImageNet. This is BigGAN trained on ImageNet. And if you look at the distribution of positions of objects in ImageNet, they're all very centered. This is, a well-known thing. And it corresponds to photographer bias. We tend to take photos of cats centered, not super zoomed in or super zoomed out, not to the side. So this is the distribution of randomly generated cats, and they tend to all be centered. So then it kind of makes sense that you couldn't make an image which is really off-center. But maybe you can take some step in that direction. So what if we we look at the distribution of samples after the transformation of shifting to the left or right. And if you shift, you can actually do something that's kind of interesting, which is kind of extrapolation, where the distribution of samples ends up kind of going outside of the distribution of the original model samples or the distribution of the data set. It doesn't go completely outside, and as you try to translate more and more and more, or shift more and more and more, you get stuck. Okay, so you can't go entirely outside the support of the data distribution, but you can shift the data distribution. It's a notion of extrapolation, but it's not like you can make it something completely new. And the extent to which you can extrapolate in this fashion is related to the statistics of the data, as you might expect. So on the x-axis in this plot, I'm showing the variance over the level of zoom, over the object size in particular, of different ImageNet categories. And on the y-axis is how much you can shift the zoom level in GAN latent space for each of those categories. Each point in this scatter plot is an ImageNet category. And two that I'll highlight are the robin at the top right and the laptop at the bottom left. Or sorry, I think I got that wrong. It's the laptop at the top right and the robin at the bottom left. The robin always appears in the same canonical size. And as a result, you can't, the model can't zoom in and out on the robin very well. Whereas the laptop appears in different sizes in the data, and as a result, the model can zoom in and out on the laptop. There also are kind of contextual biases that become apparent when you do this analysis. So let's say that I want to change the color of a fire truck or a car. If I learn a direction that changes an image toward red or toward blue, well, I can apply that to a car and change it from red to blue. If I try to apply the blueness direction to a fire truck, it doesn't work. Okay, so the data does not exhibit that kind of variation. Fire trucks do not come in blue, cars do come in blue. And so we see that the biases in the data set limit the extent to which you can perform these manipulations. And these manipulations, in turn, kind of allow us to surface and visualize these biases in the data set. Okay, so that was one thing that you can do. You can take these data points and you can manipulate them locally, but there are limitations. Those manipulations can kind of surface interesting biases in the data set. Another thing that we have looked at really recently, I wanted to throw this in just so that there's some kind of new hot off the press material in this talk. This is something that we just submitted recently, so I'll only give a little snippet of it. But it's trying to analyze to what extent are these data plus objects, these generated samples, compositional. For this project, we needed not just a generator, but also the inverse function, the encoder. So we trained up a mapping from X to Z. And now we can ask some interesting questions like, what if we take two images, we mask one, and we add it to another image mask, we create a collage, and then we put it through this encoder decoder, and what will we get? And so it turns out that you get nice compositionality. If you take the window from one image and add it to the couch from another image, you can create a generated sample that looks like the composition of the couch in front of that window. And I could put that window in a different room and it would create a different plausible kind of congealed result. This is work that Lucy and Jonas led. And you can do a lot of really interesting things with this. So I can, crop out a whole bunch of different trees that I might like and say, what would it look like if I compose each of these trees with this church? And we get essentially the same church. There's some variation, but with a whole bunch of different trees. You could do something a little bit more elaborate where you actually collage together a bunch of different pieces. This wall, and I put a painting on the wall and a window, and then I'm going to add a couch, and then pass it through this encoder decoder, and we get a living room scene that is composed of those elements. So this indicates something about the kind of compositionality of this generative model, that it can take these different independent parts and fit an image to them in a natural looking way. Okay, so regular pixels, of course, create something that looks like this really ugly collage, but these data plus objects compose to make more natural looking images. Okay. So I'm going to talk about just one more project in just the last few minutes. And this one was trying to use these types of methods for scientific visualization. So some of the things I've shown so far are interesting visualizations, but maybe not surprising. I can say, what does it look like to make this fox image more white? And I can walk in latent space in the direction of whiteness, and I get a snowy fox, and that's kind of cool. But we already knew what it looked like to add snow to an image. We didn't really learn anything new. So in this other project, we said, well, could we try to visualize something where we don't know what it looks like? Can we say, what does it look like to make an image more memorable? And this is work that Laura and Alex did that they published at AICCW last year. We call it GANalyze, toward visual definitions of cognitive image properties. Okay, so how do you do this? Well, first we need some definition of memory. And we went back to old work that we had done, where we had tried to measure the memorability of images as a kind of psychophysical experiment, where we show people a sequence of images and we have them perform a repeat detection task. And we can then measure how likely you are to remember an image given that you saw it once before. And it turns out that landscapes, even though they're beautiful, are not very memorable, but images with people and this guy in the ball pit turn out to be super memorable. And if you've ever seen me give one of these talks again, you probably remember that guy in the ball pit. Okay, so we could try visualizing this kind of data. We can just rank the images by their memorability. And we get a plot like this, where I'm just showing increasing memorability toward the bottom and to the right. And it's pretty hard to interpret. We can kind of see, well, maybe the more frontal-facing dogs are more memorable, but I don't really know. So this is a visualization with data. Now, what could we do with the visualization using data plus plus? Okay, so we do the same trick that we did before. We take a latent z vector and we try to find and we can sample an image from that z vector. It's this dog. And now we can try to find a direction to walk in latent space that will increase the memorability of that dog. And the way we do that is we have a model that predicts the memorability of an image. It's a differentiable model, so we can find a direction that will increase the score, the predicted score of memorability in the image. We can walk toward higher memorability. Okay, so it's the same kind of method. We take z, we walk in a step of size alpha in a direction theta to make an image more or less memorable. Mathematically, we have our target memorability, which is A, the assessed memorability of a generated image G of Z, plus an increment alpha, or minus an increment alpha. And then we have our transformed memorability, which is A of G of the transformation of Z by an amount alpha. And what happens when we do this is we can take a step toward the positive direction and make this dog more memorable, or take a step toward the negative direction and make it less memorable. And now we get a visualization, which is more like a continuum, and it's much clearer, at least to me, what properties might be underlying memorability here. So we can think of this as kind of visual definition of this cognitive property that was otherwise hard to imagine. And this can surface a lot of interesting candidate features that might underline memorability. We're thinking of this as visualization, and then once we've identified these candidates, we did do subsequent analysis to show that they really are, they do have a causal effect on memory. We ran subsequent causal experiments in the lab on humans. Okay, so in other words, I can identify that there's a property like object size, where if I increase memorability, it often increases the object size of an image. And if I actually do that to an image and measure how well somebody remembers it, they end up remembering it better. Some other interesting properties that come out are like circularity. This snake becomes more circular. A lot of objects become more centered and square and circular. We have something that might be called like simplicity. Things become a little bit easier to interpret. Often objects become red. That has a small effect. So this surfaces a lot of interesting properties. I don't think I have time to go into all of them, but there's more details in the paper. We can also do this type of analysis to visualize other properties that might be hard to define in words. So for example, aesthetics. We can find a direction that makes an image more aesthetic or less aesthetic, and then visualize that continuum. So we take a mushroom, we can make it more aesthetic, it becomes more saturated. We take this wine glass, we get a depth of field effect. We can even do this on other attributes like emotional valence. We could take this teddy bear and make it more negatively valent or more positively valent. When it becomes negative, it gets a little bit depressing looking, like an old teddy bear. And when I make it more positive, it starts to smile and it looks all nice and saturated. Okay. So each of these different cognitive properties corresponds to a different image transformation. We can put them all side by side and start to visualize the difference. Memorability makes this dog really expressive and zoomed in. Aesthetics does not zoom in, but makes the dog look very pretty and have nice depth of field. More details are in the paper. I think we're pretty much out of time, so I want to wrap up. But what I want to kind of leave you with is this idea of a slightly different way of looking at generative models, thinking of them just as like data, but better. They're this decorated data with extra functionality. This special data defines special operators that allow you to do things like interpolation, extrapolation, manipulation, composition. And so everything you could do with regular data, you could try to do with samples from a generative model, along with the extra structure the generative model gives you. And maybe it will work better. And I think a lot of people are thinking about this for data augmentation. I've shown mostly visualization applications, and I think there's just a lot more to do. So thank you to all my co-authors, and if there's any time for questions, I'm happy to answer them.
So in terms of time, let's just ask one question, which is also posted in the chat by Ravi. So the question is, does manipulating the latent vector result in more than one change in the image space? Like changing the latent vector, you can change both the zooming in and the shifting effect.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So there's a lot of correlated changes that occur. And I think one interesting thing to do is try to decorrelate those, but that might require training, and that's kind of one of the grand challenges of generative modeling, train a model that has more decorrelated latent dimensions. I think a good example of the correlations that we see are all of these examples I was showing you are walking in the direction toward higher memorability, but the names I'm giving them are the correlated attributes. So object size changes when I make the image more memorable. Circularity changes. So all of these attributes are correlated, and some of them might be spurious correlations and some of them might be real correlations. We actually tried to look which ones are spurious and which are real in the paper, and most of them seem to be real, meaning that they really do have an effect on memory. And memory is this multi-dimensional thing where there's a lot of underlying attributes. But I could imagine that in other cases, you might have spurious correlations.
Okay, great. And thank you, Philip, for the great talk. And it would be great if you can look at the chat for more questions and replies.
Sure, I'll try to answer some questions in chat right now.
A/B testing, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
great.
Okay, Philip, can you stop sharing? So let me introduce our next speaker, Andrew Kanazawa. She's currently a research scientist at Google and will be starting as an assistant professor at UC Berkeley. And she has done very exciting work on human pose and shape recovery from images. And she also works on recovering pose and shape of animals, such as lions, tigers, bears, zebras, and birds. So let's welcome Andrew.
Great, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Anju. Okay, great. So let's jump into it. So like Dejin said, what I work on is 3D, and I think it's super fun. So I started reconstructing cats. These are my two cats. Lots of mainly I reconstruct animals and humans. I think 3D is a fun thing because, you know, you can get all of these actual things that you can have. You can actually reconstruct yourself also. So this isn't a talk that this isn't a work that I'm talking about here, but this is a work that we presented at ICCB to reconstruct people's clothing and surface from a single image. And Shinsuke, the first author, worked on. Oh, oops! He has a poster on this. Okay, yeah. Okay, sorry. So we use this approach and we run it on all of the authors, and then we 3D printed all of us, which is also really fun. So there are all these nice fun things you can do. Shinsuke has a new work in this CVPR that is making this PIFU approach even better. So if you want to learn more about this, please check it out. So obviously, if you have 3D, you can print things, and like that's actually really fun. And here are more printing that we did from like the animal work. And so I encourage everyone who is doing 3D work to 3D print your work because it's a nice thing to have. But just aside from 3D, right? There's a lot of aside from 3D printing, there's a lot of interesting things you can do if you could understand the 3D extent of the people and objects in the image. Now, so this is like a cool channel on Instagram that creates a lot of these fun content. But in order to do this kind of effects, you need to understand, you know, how far people go around, like their poses and everything. Okay. Of course, there's other ways to do really cool, you know, visual effects like this music video. And so there are many ways that 3D can be used for content creation. So in this talk, I want to talk about how can we recover 3D from images without too much supervision. If you really want to recover 3D, like we can't be relying on artist-made 3D data. How can we recover 3D from just watching image collections, for example? And then I'm going to talk about this in the context of birds that we printed here also. And for those of you who are somewhat familiar with work, I'm going to slightly talk about more exploratory work where we study how we can get rid of key points, but that's just like a slight preview. So yes, so that's really what I want to talk about today. And I think what makes animals interesting is that they are hard to 3D scan, right? So like that's what I'm trying to illustrate with this bird running away over here, which is that you don't have the ground truth 3D supervision for many animals because they move around and everything. And so when you think about 3D, if you're not familiar with 3D, maybe the first thing that you might think about is multi-view. If you had multiple pictures of the same object from different views, then you can use a lot of these geometric approaches to recover the 3D, right? Today we can reconstruct Rome, and for certain objects like chairs, this works. Okay, but like for many deformable objects, well, first of all, so this mostly works only for rigid objects. So if the objects are not rigid, then you have to capture them exactly at the same time, which means you have to have them in a very special environment, which is challenging, like a lab, which can't scale. And also another thing is like maybe they're still rigid, but like you still don't have multiple view setup. Okay, so that's the kind of setting that I'm going to focus on today. So what we're going to focus on is a setting where you have multiple shapes and each one of them are slightly different, and you have slightly different viewpoints for every single one. So you have a bird, you might see it from one viewpoint, you have another bird, see it from a different viewpoint, and you have a different kind of bird that now it's a yellow bird that you're looking at it. Okay, so under this setting, which I think is most common, how can we actually recover 3D from this? Okay, and today I just want to go over the general paradigm for this kind of setting. So when you don't actually have ground truth 3D and therefore you can't do supervised learning, what do you do? So I think this is a very common paradigm, so I just want to draw it out with many examples. So first of all, what you do is you learn some kind of morphable or generative model from 3D data. Okay, so let's go back to this classic work of SIGGRAPH 1999 from Blanz and Vetter. What they did was get lots of 3D faces and then learn a morphable face model. And then once you have this model where you can change and manipulate the face type, you can give an image and you can initialize it to some degree, and then you can actually fit this model to the data. So they use differentiable rendering, a custom one here. Okay, another example that people might be familiar with is a 3D scan of humans. So you have lots of these 3D scans. From that, you can actually learn the shape statistics of people, like how tall they are or short they are. You can throw some kinematic tree in here, and then you get this very popular SMPL simple model that a lot of people use for 3D human research. And then what you can do is, now that you have this model, and maybe you have 2D key points or something like this, you can optimize, solve for the parameters of the model that explains the image observation. In this case, it's key points, okay, and with lots of other priors. If you have enough data, if you have enough 2D data, there are ways to learn directly to predict this from an image. Okay, so I think you're starting to see this pattern. So let's do one more. So more recent work, we took this simple approach, but we actually scanned a couple of toy animals, not too many, like less than 30. And then we learned this morphable model of animal species, animal families. And then once you have this, again, you can actually fit this to data. You can use these key points, and then you want to minimize reprojection loss, or if you have multiple viewpoints with key points, then you can actually recover the texture as well. Okay, so I think in many cases, even if it's just not animals, this is a very similar pattern. You need some kind of 3D data that can deform, and then you fit that to the image. Okay, so this is a good paradigm, but really the challenge is that you have to learn this morphable model from 3D data. So what do you do if you don't have lots of 3D data? Today, that's the kind of direction that I want to talk about, which is the hybrid direction, where you learn the morphable 3D model from image collection without having an actual 3D data or lots of them. Then you want to do this while you're fitting to data at the same time. So, so the line of work that is exploring this direction is this work on category-specific mesh reconstruction that I worked on with Shubham Talsiani and Alyosha and Jitendra at Berkeley. Okay, so again, just to clarify, the goal over here is to we can learn a 3D deformable or morphable shape model from 2D information. So we want something like that face model or human body that you can change the knob and changes the shape of the birds. And then we want to do this from 2D information without ground truth 3D, as in, so we will use this image and the key points of images and the silhouettes. So by key points, I mean there are 14 or so small sparse key points, each labeled on this bird image, and we're going to use that as supervision. But we don't actually get to see any like ground truth 3D different shapes of birds for each image. Okay, so how do we do this? And the idea of this is that the approach that we're taking is during training, we will see many images of birds. So we want to learn what bird shapes are like, such that at this time you see an image and you can apply this knowledge and then you can reconstruct the image. Now, like, why do we think, if you don't have any ground truth 3D, what are the kind of techniques in going above this problem? So the first is to really consider the image formulation, right? So when you take an image of a bird or any image, what is actually happening? What is actually happening is that there is an underlying 3D world which you have taken a picture of from some viewpoint. And that underlying 3D world contains a 3D object. And the 3D object might have a texture, like this texture mapping that I'm kind of visualizing as an unwarped image. And then so if you take a picture of this bird from a different view, then you get a different bird. Okay, and then this is the same for different other kind of birds. If you change the texture, you'll get a different bird. And you can change the shape of the bird and also the texture, and you'll get different different views and different shapes. So the idea is really that of analysis by synthesis or inverse graphics or render and compare, very similar to the other kind of older work in Blunt and Vetter that we've done, which is that we have some kind of model. We're going to try to recover these components that consist of an image, and we can use this decomposition or factorization as a cue to learn each of these components from an image. Okay, so that's really the disentanglement idea. So you take an image and you know that there's a camera, you know there's a shape, and you know there's texture. There's also other things like lighting that we didn't particularly consider in this particular work, but you can also add. And the idea is once you have these things, you can look at it from many different viewpoints. Okay. All right, so more specifically, what you do is you take an image and you pass it through a convolutional neural network, which outputs the camera, shape, and texture, and some parameterization. We can render all of these things together, and you can get this image. And the fundamental idea of it, like, is to ask, does this rendered image look like the input? And then you can use this as a training. But again, okay, so let's kind of recall upon like why we said that we need key points. So in this work, we need key points because we really need to ground the cameras using key points and structure motion. So what we do is every single image has this kind of key points. So, and then they are labeled per semantic. So you can see where the left eye is in all bird images and where the right eye is. Okay, so then you can just treat them as if they are correspondences that you've acquired from multi-view data. And so they don't actually correspond to a single bird. But they correspond to, it's a key points. So, but we pretend as if they're coming from a single bird, and you can run structure for motion from this. Then you will get a very coarse mean shape like this, and then viewpoints for each picture. What you do is you take this camera, every single image now, because of the key points, has some idea of like which direction I'm looking at this bird from. Okay, and now we're gonna call this camera SFM. And then we're going to use this as our part of our supervision. So when we predict the camera branch is regularized or trained with this goal, which is to predict the camera from SFM. And we also have this key point reprojection loss, which is to obtain the 3D key points from the meshes and then render it so that it matches the 2D key point. In particular, key point reprojection is not as important as other people might think. What is really important is that we have a camera, but I'll also get into that later. But then, because you have the texture, you can also compute the reconstruction loss on the foreground, and then you can also do this silhouette. Okay, all right. So when it comes to shape, how is the actual shape being represented? So this is a morphable model. You can very simply think of it as like a linear basis in a PCA, for example. So we are going to use mesh in this work. So there's going to be endpoints, and each of these endpoints is obtained. The vertices of the mesh, the faces are fixed. The vertices of the mesh are combined as a sum of learned mean shape, and that is single n by 3 for the entire birds. And then the deformation, how to move each vertices according to the image. And this is per instance. So every single image gets to move its vertices a little bit so that you can capture slightly different bird shapes. And so this is really the model. So this is like a mean plus a basis, output of the linear basis that you sum to get the final shape. And then the idea is that we don't know the space of this deformation, because if we actually had 3D scans, then we can pre-compute this statistically. But we don't know this, so we want to learn this as we go, trying to fit the data. So that's some of like the hybrid. That's why it's a little bit of a hybrid, because we don't have any 3D. Okay. All right, so when it comes to texture, I really like this picture. You have this chocolate Santa and you eat it, then you can unwrap it, and you notice that this three-dimensional Santa can be wrapped up into a 2D plane. And so this is a very common concept in graphics, where you take a UV image, which is this on a planar view of the shape. So recall all of the birds that in our bird shapes are a deformation from the mean. And the mean, we designed it so that it is topologically homeomorphic to a sphere. So once you actually have this UV image, you can unwrap the sphere using polar coordinates. And then once you color this UV image, you know how to color the sphere, and you also know how to color the mean bird, and you know how to color the rest of the birds. So the mesh representation, the canonical mesh representation, gives us a nice space to predict this texture. So we can formulate a convolutional neural network that takes an image and outputs this UV image. Okay, and it also has some other kind of geometric priors, like you want it to be smooth, or you want the vertices to be symmetric. But if you run this approach, you can. It's on test set that I've also printed earlier. You can run on different birds and notice there are different tail shapes, and it can capture this deformation of the bird in terms of without the articulation. Although it also captured the wings over here without actually seeing any ground truth 3D shapes. Okay, so you can also try this on cars, which we did. But another nice thing is that because of this factorized nature, we can simply swap the components of the texture to the texture image, like the UV image, to texture the birds from one to the other. And so that was an approach, and we had some results in 2018. And I think this is a step towards scalable 3D learning from images, right? Because we don't need to rely on 3D data. But how can we do better? So really the problem here is that we relied on key points. And this isn't the only work that relies on key points. A lot of the work on animals requires key points. And the key points are a problem because you do need a per image labels. Per image labels, I think, is a lot more harder to get. And it also requires semantics, right? It's difficult to automate this kind of thing. I mean, there are methods that are automating 2D key points, but it's very difficult to maintain their 3D consistency. And so I think it's the chicken and the egg type problem. Okay, so how can we get rid of the key points? So in order to study this problem, we got another Shubham. So Shubham graduated, and now he's at CMU. Or at FAIR, but we got a new Shubham who is interested in working on this problem. And today I want to talk a little bit about this new work that will be on arXiv soon, which is called Shape and Viewpoints Without Key Points. So just to, our goal is to get rid of key points, but we still need silhouettes, okay? So we have an image and a silhouette. That's now our training data. And obviously silhouette is also per pixel, but I think silhouette is something where we can foreseeably see it being a lot more automated. And in fact, some of our experiments are obtained with automatic silhouettes as well. And it's I think easier to make it more category agnostic than it is for key points. But we got rid of key points, but then we still need one more thing, which is a single initial shape. I just want to be upfront about this because, you know, we want to make it unsupervised, but you know, still need somewhere to start with. And in this work, we actually start with a single initial template shape, and it doesn't have to be too close to the actual shape of the thing. So, but we actually take this mesh from a similar work, also by Shubham and Anilesh, called canonical surface mapping, which is a work to discover dense correspondences without explicit 3D supervision. But they also use this template shape, and we also start with the same template shape. Okay, but so recall we needed the key points for structure for motion to fixing the camera motion, and then we had this camera loss. So what happened if we just, you know, presented to do the work that the CMR work, but without actually using the camera supervision? So, you know, we had a supervision on this camera, but we could just get rid of it and have this reconstruction loss guide the process. You know, what would happen if you did that? The thing is, when you do that, what happens is that it leads to camera collapse in a degenerate shape. So this is a test image, and like we might get a shape that actually somewhat explains the silhouettes, but when you look at it from the front view, it's completely flat. And so this happens because this is similar to any kind of optimization process. It's very sensitive to initialization. And of course, when you start to predict the camera, like regressing the 3D rotation is a challenging problem. And aside from that, you're not going to get it right in the beginning. And so when you try to reconstruct the image with a bad camera, instead of moving the camera, it's much easier for the shape to compensate and like become a slightly flat. Then this also leads to bad camera, and this system kind of just accumulates on top of each other, and you just get a collapse where the camera is only predicting few modes, and the shape is just a flat thing that explains the input image. Okay, so our approach is that instead of predicting the camera, let's optimize a set of K cameras for each training instance. So, and then we call this set of camera a camera multiplex. And so the idea here, and then we initialize the camera multiplex with a template shape, and this is why it can't be exactly just a sphere. The non-sphere thing is better. So, okay, so given an image, what you do is you actually, for every single training image, we actually store a set of possible cameras that could be explaining this image, okay? And for every single camera, we can render the current shape and texture predictions, and then get a loss per camera, and then backprop on each camera according to how much loss it incurred. Okay, and so this is somewhat similar to particle filtering, or the idea of some search like this, because we keep multiple possible solutions, and then we can adjust a little bit of this. And we found this to be a much more stable way than to hedge bets and trying to predict a single camera, which is challenging, and there's not that much win. So more specifically, what we do is take an image, and you use this similar components to predict the shape and the texture. And then on the other hand, you also keep this key value pair for each image, and then you save like 40 cameras or so, and then for every single camera, you render the image, right? And then you compute the loss in terms of silhouettes and texture reconstruction. And from this loss, you can compute the softmax of this loss and get the probability of optimal camera. Okay, and so maybe the first camera is most likely. Then you update the shape and the texture according to this first camera. I also backprop each of the camera according to how bad it was, so that each of the cameras can adjust. Okay, so really that's the idea. And I think to those of you who are not doing 3D, I think this is a general concept, which is that instead of betting on one prediction, maintain a possible set of solutions. And you can still backprop, you know, these are just variables stored as a key value pairs. So you can still backprop on all of these cameras that you're optimizing. So it's kind of like a hybrid between optimization. I mean, it's still backprop optimization of the whole network, but instead of just network weights, you also include camera viewpoints. Okay, so what do you do at test time? Because like no component is actually predicting test camera. So what you do is once the pose and the shape converges, then you can actually just use a feed-forward camera training on the best camera in the multiplex for each image, and then train this G, so that at test time you have all the components what you want to do. You want to get the shape in the camera, in the texture. Okay, so if you look really at this is a very good illustration of the camera. So you take all of the cameras of the viewpoints using the SFM, okay, in the data set, and then you can visualize this in the polar coordinates. So we're showing that you unwrap the viewing spheres into this plane, and we're putting the plots of the test data. Okay, so this is CMR with key points. So this is supervised with the SFM camera. This is the previous work. And so this is what happens if you train without the key points. You can clearly see the collapse that's happening. And so you actually take the CSM work, which also predicts the camera with their CSM framework. You see that it's slightly better because it captures a little bit more modes, but it's still, you see the collapse. And so this is why you can't really update the shape with this camera. And the UCMR is the way we're calling our multiplex approach for unsupervised CMR. And this one gets a lot better distribution. Okay, and so you can also evaluate this quantitatively, and this is what the camera gets. So obviously the CMR is the one that uses ground truth, so it gets the best loss. But without the key points, it's worse. And then CSM is over here. If you do the reprojection without the texture, it's not as good because you can't disambiguate between the front and the back. And the UCMR gets the best rotation error in this without using any key points. So here are some of the results that you get on test images of the birds. So it still captures different kind of variation of the shapes. So we can take all of these outputs, and then you can run PCA on the shapes. And then you can see that it does capture various kind of shape variety. And then these shapes, note that they're quite far from the template shapes, and it has learned the more variation of data from just the image collections. Okay, so here are some results on cars, but cars was in CMR also, so let's move on to something new, because now that we don't need key points, we can actually do this. So here are some motorcycles, and again, here's some PCA on motorcycles, so you can see that there's small types of changes of the seats and the handle shapes. And then another data set that we tried this, now that we don't need key points, is that we also tried shoes, and here's some results on the shoes with the texture. Yeah, okay, so I think I'm coming out of time, but here are some variation on shoes. So what we noticed was that this shoe data set probably doesn't have as much variation, but still you can see kind of like, you know, flat type shoes to some kind of variation that it has captured in data. Okay, so that I think I'm running out of time, and the takeaway for this talk is good camera is key in learning the 3D shape model from images. Once you have the camera, I think there's a lot of ways you can take it far away. And so instead of trying to predict a single camera, which is difficult to optimize when there's possible solutions are far away from each other, instead of hedging, you can hedge bets by keeping multiple possible camera in this simple multi-camera multiplex approach. And so this reduces the amount of supervision required. Instead of every single image has to have key points, we now have like a template shape and silhouettes, and then there's a lot more possibilities for learning from 3D images. Okay, and I think that was 25 minutes.
Thanks for the great talk. And so let's take some questions from the audience. The first one is, does the network enforce symmetry? For example, if the bird opens its right wing, will your network enforce both wings to be open, or how does it figure out?
Yeah, so in the first work, we did impose symmetry. We still impose symmetry in the vertices. And if you have the camera, like the symmetry is not really necessarily there to make a like round bird as you saw, but it's really there so that one wing is not longer than the other. Yeah, so we still have the camera symmetry.
Okay, and we have some more questions about the camera. So the first one is the camera multiplex for the extrinsic with fixed intrinsic?
Yes, it is correct. In this work, we actually only use weak perspective camera. So it's just extrinsic with a fixed intrinsic, that's right, yeah. So we basically just keep couple of viewpoints to search for.
Okay, and another question is, do you shift or extrapolate from the fixed K cameras to other camera positions? And
right. So I think K of the each of the cameras can actually move around. So this is why it's kind of like particle filtering without the resampling action. So you have like each of these Ks, and every single one of them figures out how to move proportionally to how much loss they've been, how bad they were.
Okay. And I think last one is about the feature, the key points. Do you have human annotation, or do you have a network to predict the key points?
So we don't use any key points at all in the second work. In the first one, the human has recorded it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, let's thank Andrew again for the great talk. And now we are going to take about 8-minute break and resume at 1:10 Seattle time for the next keynote. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I'm still connected, and Matthias asked a good question about how far are the templates away from the results of the motorcycles and cars and shoes. So for the, I should have shown you a picture of that. We will put that in paper. It doesn't have to be that close. I mean, it does change significantly from the template, or it might look, I think I need to show the picture of that. But I think the thing is that I think the key here is that it learns the deformation from the data, and you can see some changes, as opposed to the original template shape is fixed. And it would be a really good study to do some kind of see how far away, how explicitly does the shape have to be for each of the categories. Okay.
Is my camera on, and can you hear me? Hey, Andrew.
Hi, Johan.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, let's see if you can see my screen too. I'm going to share my screen.
I think we saw your screen.
Yeah, we can show your screen. Can you see my screen now? Yes. Okay. Well, let me know when you want me to start.
So we'll start at 10:10. So it's about 6 minutes. Yeah.
Um, Hello, everyone. Thanks for staying at the AI for Content Creation workshop. Right now, we have a new session. In this session, we'll have 2 speakers and 1 paper session. So first, let me introduce the first speaker, Professor Irfan. He's a distinguished professor in School Interactive Computing and Associate Dean of Research in College of Computing at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He's also a research scientist and a research lead of the content creation effort in the Google Research Mountain View. So without further ado, let's hand it over to him and about his talk AI for content creation.
Thank you, Lou. I hope everybody can hear me. It's kind of always odd to give a presentation where you cannot see the people that you're giving a presentation to. Well, today what I thought I'd give you is a little bit of a kind of 30 to 40,000 feet view of AI for content creation. Both Philip and Andrew gave a very good solid talk about some of the details on how you can actually manipulate content once you have a lot of data, both in 2D and 3D. Just to give you context, my interest in computational methods for AI comes because of my interest in things like computational video, which is really interested in understanding how camera can be used to create content. The kind of examples that I'll talk about would be in that space. Also, I'm really interested in using a camera to understand more about the environment dynamics, scene understanding, what's happening, can we actually predict and analyze scenes. Also really interested in a lot of work that I've done with my students and teammates for years on how do you actually model the phenomenon that you see in dynamic environments, how do you use it to understand and plan ahead with these types of things. And then, of course, there's been a lot of interest I've had recently on trying to understand how people create content, how people author content. Now, of course, combining this, one of the interests that I have is the whole area of how do you do this kind of stuff in the world of video. So with that, the kinds of things I'm going to touch on today is basically ask questions about what can machine learning, artificial intelligence, and computer vision, the conference that we're in today, can do for content creation. What kinds of new tools for content creation are needed? That's the kind of conversation we should be having a little bit. And once the biggest thing is, computer vision and AI, the real field that we come from, is much more about understanding the content. If I see a picture of a bird, what kind of bird it is, where is it with respect to the environment? Well, how can I actually use that content understanding to generate newer forms of content? And then what kinds of content to generate out of it? And then, of course, the big question is, how can people like us who work in the field of computer vision can help content creators generate more content? I'll situate all of this in a variety of different ways today, and hopefully, just if nothing else, foster conversations. One of the biggest things I always talk about it is one of the things that's really happened is the ubiquity of a camera. It's everywhere. We're going to talk about that as how that's changed the whole paradigm of how media and content is created. I'll show you specific examples of how can we use that kind of a camera in video to enhance content, improve on the quality of content that's given to us, annotate and kind of mark out different aspects of it. I'm not going to talk about generating content today because of lack of time, but we will talk a little bit about the holy grail that comes out of this. Given a lot of content, how can we quickly summarize it? Again, remember, a lot of stuff that's happened in the context of media has been text and audio and stuff. We want to start doing this extensively for images and video. And I might mention a few ongoing efforts that we have. Just to kind of situate it, again, this is a very high-level talk. I'm going to overview a lot of different types of things. And I might also be referring to some really old stuff that you may not have seen, just to kind of situate where we're going with this. Simplify a whole lot of complicated concepts. This is a talk that there will be no databases. There's going to be no GANs or convnets and stuff like that. And technical details, of course, I refer you to my papers. Let's start off with a simple conversation around that cameras are everywhere. How does that change the whole paradigm, right? So one thing which we all know, that basic purpose of camera, or the first ever camera, has been to capture light, right? Capture the light that's around there. And of course, we've created various sets of artifacts to do this, variety of different types of cameras. Of course, the bottom line with each and every one of them has been as to how do you take light that's around us to a sensor of some sort to save it, and then of course can be used it for a variety of different types of things. So the way to look at it as a camera is two different things. One, of course, it's a sensor that can sense the environment. We can use this for scene understanding, trying to understand what's in the scene, kind of, again, trying to understand the human vision system or robotic vision system. But the thing we also need to attend to a little bit, that it's also a experience capture storytelling device. We use it to tell stories around it. And if you actually play around in social media, you know that we take pictures, we share it, and it's kind of telling stories of what we are interested in. So using that, we have to kind of remember that camera evolved with nothing else from historically in different forms, from a very hard to use device to a completely mobile device, and also has taken on various different forms, mobile cameras, wearable cameras and stuff. One of the things that I claim that has happened is that video, our relationship with cameras and videos has changed. We've gone away from that early mode where we basically set up a camera and kind of use that as a fixed mode device, into much more stand away from it and a casual device. And that kind of stuff has changed what kinds of content is out there. It's much more casual content. A lot of people, anybody can produce that content. And this is also showcased by this simple example of just looking at the amount of cameras out there. This plot just shows over historically the sale of a camera over time. This is of course showing DSLRs and stuff like that. And then of course you start looking at it, and then you have to really zoom out to see that this is actually a very old plot, but the number of cameras out there is now pretty much catching up. And in this case, 4 billion. I think right now there is more than one camera per person on the planet out there. So the number of cameras are different, which has resulted in a phenomenon that now when you go to a place like this, of course, the problem initially was to be able to get close to Mona Lisa to watch it. Of course, the image of Mona Lisa is already online in various types of VR setup. The other problem, of course, is nowadays it's even hard to see the camera or see the Mona Lisa because there's a camera in front of it or occluding it. So I think we've really now reached, so we have to kind of start thinking about how to showcase these types of things differently. So using this metaphor of cameras everywhere, let's actually think about what can we use it for. So here's a kind of process that I want us to think about it is what kinds of data is out there? What kind of video data is out there? Cameras are used, again, as I said, for narratives, capturing experiences and storytelling, and also for sensing. But user-generated content, small content like these few examples that we've worked on ourselves, is becoming predominant. You see a lot more of that kind of stuff shared, and there's a whole lot of computer vision going on. This is an example of a surveillance camera. So this, you may remember many years ago, there was a landing of an airplane in the Hudson in New York, and a surveillance camera was able to capture everything that, how this plane landed. Now, of course, if you're paying attention to current news, there's a whole lot of that kind of citizen and or other types of cameras that are actually capturing content, and it's being used in changing the narrative around it. So surveillance data is important. Of course, another whole type of data that's out there that in computer vision deals with is autonomous driving. How do you kind of work on analysis of scenes to do a variety of things? What we forget is the large amount of other content that's out there is professionally produced content. TV shows, movies, and more importantly, sports. I mean, sports is a multi-billion-dollar, all of these are multi-billion-dollar industries where a whole lot of content created, professionally produced content. How do you leverage that kind of an understanding? I mean, I know people that work for major production houses like Netflix and other types of things, the newer ones, are doing a lot of work on annotation of this kind of data. So just to kind of point this out, this is pre-COVID, numbers are very different now, that most of the bandwidth out there, 15 to 40%, is Netflix. YouTube is somewhere in the 11-12% range with about 4 to 5 hours of uploaded video every minute. Amazon Prime showcases a lot of this stuff. And again, if you look at it, web browsing is about 7 to 8% right now. But most of the content that we see online with images and videos is basically, again, either professionally produced or sometimes micro videos. Of course, cameras are changing. We talked about that. This is just an example I like to show as how a camera evolution has gone a little bit. And this is an artistic project that Sasha Flops did in 2008, which was a camera that, if you look at it, does not even have optics associated with it. The way it worked was you took a picture and used the geolocation to download another image that was similar to it. This one actually takes it to the next level. Before you take a picture, it downloads another picture, and now you're just using your camera to augment it. So that's now kind of doing creative content capturing by using understanding of where you are and what pictures you're taking and augmenting it next level. So that actually changes the way I think about cameras as a creation device. Another that I love, this is a project that actually is very interesting also, which is basically every time you took a picture, it printed out what was in the scene. Now, for those of you in computer vision, this is, of course, the holy grail of the computer vision problem. Of course, they cheated. What they did in this instance was they showcased this picture on Amazon Mechanical Turk. Somebody who saw the picture typed it in, and now you got a nice printout. So how do you kind of start really kind of understanding how the media itself is changing? Two very interesting examples of this one. So now the question comes up, once we have cameras everywhere, how does it change? And again, I can give you historical examples of this. From 1963, there was a chance camera that actually captured the Kennedy assassination, something you may have heard a lot about right now with the Rodney King beatings, where there was a documentary film maker at a different block that walked over and captured all of this. But now you start seeing that these kinds of things are becoming very ubiquitous. You can see these kinds of instances of cameras capturing events that nobody predicted that anybody wanted to see. I used the Meteor example because these were cameras in cars that were being used to just do insurance analysis and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, we got amazing pictures of what's actually coming down in Russia. But of course, if you're paying any attention to news these days, cameras are actually now showcasing a whole lot of what's going on in terms of our society. So, you know, lots of things going on. This is what I refer to basically is now become a beast with a billion eyes. You can practically see anywhere and any place on the planet because there's somebody out there with a camera taking a picture. And that's basically changing the paradigm of how content is captured. So just to building on that one is what kind of data is out there. I showed you this example again. There could be different types of instances of it, but this was actually captured perfectly, both in images and videos, the landing in the Hudson. And again, we can now reconstruct a whole lot of these types of things. So the question now comes up, and I'll just show you one or two very simple examples of what can be done with these types of videos. So one is, you know, as I said, there's a whole lot of bad videos out there because, you know, cameras are still something we hold in our hands and we take videos and stuff like that. So this was an example of something that I suffered with. In fact, this was me taking a video once and it was very shaky. What we wanted was improved, unshakable, improved kinds of videos. This was a long time ago, but this is the kind of stuff that's now ubiquitous out there. I mean, we took this stuff and now, of course, you have a video like this where somebody's jogging and you can't see anything. Right? So this is content that's been captured. How do you want to improve on this content? Well, we can figure out how to stabilize it. So this is a system that was built many years ago. I was running on YouTube for a while that lets you upload videos and improve the quality of videos like this. And you can see them next to each other to see that the earthquake version versus a stabilized version. And of course, these kinds of technologies, now you're seeing this built into both cameras, mobile phones, and stuff like that. And in fact, you know, this continues. So for example, I showed you some examples earlier. You can take these types of content that was captured and improve and kind of start having more different types of effect. The water is flowing, kind of has more of a dynamic effect. Everything is stabilized, and you can do a whole lot of things with it. Again, many different applications of this now running on your phones, even actually on professional cameras and stuff. Other types of things we can do with this online videos is we want to be able to mark things out, be able to kind of do interesting things with it. So for example, in this case, this is an old video again from our work, I want to be able to click on one part of the image and have one thing completely segmented. Now it's not perfect. You can see the back, and sometimes as she comes up again, the black sign of the hair and the black sign kind of merge. So, but remember, this was just one click. How do you start kind of now providing tools for people to be able to understand what the foreground and the background of these types of things are? Just another example of the same kinds of thing. This is based on our segmentation many years ago, but is now by just being able to look at this video and clicking on one object, can we now be able to annotate it and also then visualize this in different aspects and different views and stuff like that on the same video. As you notice, the video completely changed, but the object is still being tracked. This was part of a bigger system that I won't talk about today either, but this is the kind of stuff that now you can actually move in and blur out objects in videos, and this is running on YouTube again. You can blur out objects and stuff like that. Again, taking content and manipulating content differently. Simple stuff, but building on a whole lot of computer technologies that many people in this room know about. But using this to actually just change, again, online content. This can be applied to many different ways of doing, again, stabilization improvement, can also apply to VR types of things that is shown here. Again, you can track hands and stuff like that. If anybody's interested, we can show you more examples of this kind of stuff. So the holy grail that I kind of think about it is once you have a whole lot of this kind of content, is can you also start figuring out how to summarize this kind of stuff or reduce its size in many different ways. Now, compression is, of course, always been a big part of the whole content analysis part, but I want to be able to do this kind of stuff in a much more semantic level. So imagine if you see a TV show, can it be summarized? The same kinds of things that has happened on text content, though of course really hard to still today, is given a long book, can you give me a small summary of it? It's been done in text world, and of course these days we're getting a lot of auto-generated text also. Question now comes up is, can you do this for video? So this is one of the projects we played around with in this space also, except that this one for specifically the area of sports. But can you actually look at sports videos and figure out very quickly, generate a highlight version of it? So we actually built a rather large system out of this one, which was published many years ago, that kind of does exactly that, is looks at videos and takes a whole lot of additional information out of this to be able to generate a summary, a highlight reel of this. Something, again, if you're a sports fan, you know that most sports companies like ESPN and Fox do this for all sports. Of course, they do it manually. Here, I might show you a few videos and stuff like that. I don't know if it's going to be visible very well, but we'll see how we can go. But here, of course, looking at this example of this sports thing, there's, of course, players. In addition to that, there's an audience. Then there is, of course, a whole group of people sitting at the bottom. There are experts analyzing this thing. And then there is a whole lot of other camera operators and others that are watching. The goal we had in this one was, let's not just do video analysis, but let's do a analysis of the scene to be able to then figure out how can we actually figure out what's the most important part of the game based on player movements, based on what the audience is doing, what the experts are marking, and what the camera operator is doing. So using this basically is a system we built that actually, I'm going to skip over some of these details. In the area of basketball, because again, there's a whole lot of video data out there. First, we use the environmental sound. That is, the audience makes sounds. Again, this is captured in the video. And then, of course, also what the commentators are saying about it. This actually provides interesting information about the content because they actually say the name of the player and what's going on. Then there are these other people on the side that are annotating the plays in detail, including the fact like, who is the player, what time frame is the play going on, sorry, going back, what is the play going on, who is the player, which team they're on, and exactly the time breakdown, the narrative per se. So using this kind of stuff, we came up with a system that actually analyzes the whole sports. And of course, we also take the timeline and align it together from what the video has to all of the other cues. And using this, we can start kind of now analyzing in detail the sports game itself. Just goes into a whole lot of detail. Again, all of this stuff is out there, but we can actually do a complete fusion across the board. This will also allows us to understand more about the stats. Of course, we can also look at other stats that are available and combine them to other things that are available. So, I don't know if you can hear this, but we can actually learn everything about the game as how things are going. Building on this, giving these types of cues, we can also, of course, go to the online sites and learn more about the players. Who are the players? What are their records? Where are they coming from? We can also look at the scoreboards and stuff like that, both online but in this case, now we can look at the narrative. How is the game changing? Who's winning? How close are they? What is the score differential at what time of the game? And this can also tell us a little bit more about how we can actually look at the timeline of a game. And also if this is getting to be much more interesting or is a close game or not. That also plays into these types of things. What kind of a game, what kind of score it is. You can use vision, of course, but we also have other things like the play-by-play tell you what kind of shot it was. So we can actually also emphasize and understand from purely a data-driven manner what's going on. Audio from the environment, we can figure out things like applauses, screams, yells, cheerleading, just from the audience. That actually tells you a little bit because there's usually a score, there's an applause and stuff like that. So you can use this as another feature. So combine all of this, you can start looking at it. So there's a whistle, there's a applause, you can actually pick up on all of this. And of course, in addition to that, the camera moves around to kind of capture things. So fast break.
Racing ahead, Gosser tries to defend, but Jennings able to make a layup.
So using all of this, we can break it down, and now we can actually come up with a way to summarize sports and highlights like this. These are a few just examples. I can't show you the whole sports out of this one, but I can say it's basically what we did in this instance was looked at the entire sport game, many of them, lots of data was collected for doing this. And we basically kind of came up with a way to generate highlights. And we, of course, did a whole lot of user studies on this one. But the bottom line that we came up with, and actually that slide is missing, I apologize, that we actually can do as well as ESPN does on this kind of stuff, which is actually, you know, kind of a very interesting challenge to have is basically we pass a Turing test of comparing ourselves to what an expert content creator would do to generate highlights. So that kind of gives you an idea. And in fact, one of the biggest questions I always ask ourselves is that, you know, as content, as we were to start doing work in the area of content creation, we pretty much have to satisfy an ability to match what humans can do. And how do we actually build that kind of stuff? So in case of ESPN, I showed basically we were able to match what experts do by analyzing everything manually, but we can now give them tools to do much better. One thing we have to also understand in the area of content creation is how do you make this be an important part of the game in terms of how you're responsible in terms of what content is created. So for example, this is again a very old bit of work of ours, and anybody who has Photoshop knows you can do this kind of stuff. It's very easy to edit content these days. You can manipulate different types of things. For example, I can take an image like this, take the skies that are from here, paste it on the back of this image, and completely change the look and feel of the image. So that kind of content understanding to content manipulation is something you can do. And this is sadly true in the world of media. I'm just showing one example of an image from a newspaper where they took two images that was shown at the bottom here and spliced them together for the top image, which was not exactly what was captured. So this kind of image manipulation can be very challenging, and of course can be also sometimes have questions associated with them. Of course, these days, if you know the world of deepfakes, this is kind of where things are going with these types of things. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there that as we move towards the era of content creation and content understanding, we have to also be cautious that as we build these tools, they can actually have a different type of an impact. So with that, I just want to say is, you know, I basically covered a huge amount of spectrum on trying to understand what content creation is all about and how we can, in the area of vision and machine learning, move towards supporting and creating tools that helps designers and creators use this kind of stuff. I did not get into a whole lot of technical details about any of this stuff, no deep learning, no GANs and stuff. I'm sure you're going to hear a lot of that, if not just today, for the rest of the week. There's a whole lot of amazing stuff happening in this area. But I just wanted to bring everybody up to speed as to there's a whole lot of fun stuff happening in the area of content creation. And we can actually use a lot of content understanding for computer vision to support it. Just to end, I kind of always love to show this example is, you know, just in like other types of things, technology has changed the way we do things. And, you know, I'd love to show this video that, yes, repetitious tasks now can be put into industrial automation. And we can actually bring a lot of tools to prevent people from doing all the repetitious tasks that they were doing before. And that's where actually a good understanding can help. So, you know, basically now anybody can create, and we need to provide better tools out of this. With that, you know, as I said, I have a huge team of people that has worked with me for years, and I just wanted to make sure that they're included here. And with that, any questions I might have, happy to look them up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think this is very great talk. Remind us there are like a lot of content creation problems out there. We as research, I mean, need to solve. So we have a question from the audience. I think the first one is, do you think it is possible to come out with a domain agnostic way of summarizing video? Like if you have a few shot system that you can quickly config to different tasks, let's say highlight the basketball game or boxing game?
So I think, summarization or highlight generation depends on the context of what the game or the is. So for example, in a sports game, we use the whole narrative of how the game evolves to help us identify key points. If you were to do this summarization, let's say for a sitcom, you would have to use other types of things to be able to understand what is in a situational comedy show or something like that. And there's a lot of examples of how you can use understanding of that one. Now, of course, vision can come in to understand is who are the actors, what are the actors doing, and then combining them if the narrative of the storyboard is available to those to be able to kind of get a physical grounding between what was the dialogue. Of course, speech recognition can provide a lot of additional information as to what was said. And that can be used to do a lot of, what I call compression or semantic compression of that stuff. So I think it really needs to be kind of focused into domains. You can't just do anything on basketball, and actually from basketball, you can apply it to cricket, because you need to know the language of cricket. But of course, the processes could be can export it from one to the other.
Okay, thank you. Another quick question. So is it possible to automatically learn possible winning strategy by analyzing tons of real game data?
So I think this is where a lot of the work that is coming from reinforcement learning types of things is going to become important. We're playing around with this a whole lot of stuff ourselves too now. That is, once we have seen a lot of games and actually we know what are kinds of optimal ways to go through it, can we define cost functions, and those cost functions can be defined in various types of optimality criteria to improve on your analysis. It's hard to do this when you have so many different parameters which you have in a game, but in simple tasks when you have a few sets of parameters, I think it is possible, and we're exploring that kind of stuff. We're doing, remember, one of the areas that my team works is also doing a lot of planning and action stuff, understanding, and I think we're applying it in that domain for now, but then we will actually be moved towards design. And in fact, one of the areas that we're interested in is thinking about is how do you actually do content, which is multimodal content creation, which might be documents with images and videos and text.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the speaker. Let's move on to the next speaker. For me, can you help me share my screen? Can you know how to share my screen? Perfect. Could you please turn off the sharing? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, so let's welcome our next speaker. Our next speaker is Justin Johnson. He's he gave us a pre-recorded video. But he will be here to answer some live questions. If you have one question, you can leave some comments. So I'm gonna play his video. He's right now assistant professor at Michigan University. I mean, he worked as a research scientist at Facebook and with Fei Li at Stanford University. I think he's famous for his work on the video reasoning, clever, and also content generation from the scene graph. So let's.
All right, I'm Justin Johnson, and today I'll be talking about generating 3D content from 2D supervision at the AI for Content Creation workshop at CVPR 2020. So I'm an assistant professor at University of Michigan and a visiting scientist at FAIR, although the work today is mostly stuff that I've done at FAIR. So in general, the last couple of years, we've seen that 2D content creation with deep neural networks has come a long way. And it's now possible to use all sorts of convolutional networks to generate really high quality images and videos, conditional with both conditional generation with things like CycleGAN and SPADE, as well as unconditional generation of images with things like BigGAN. And I've also worked quite a bit on various types of 2D content generation with deep neural networks, from tasks like captioning, where we want to generate language content to describe images, or other sorts of tasks like style transfer, steganography, or scene graph image generation, where the goal is to generate images that match some input, sort of input data. But recently, as I've started to think about what's next in the realm of content generation with neural networks, one thing that struck me is that a lot of our current methods for generating content, especially image content with deep neural networks, ignores this really critical fact that the world is in fact three-dimensional. So a lot of the sort of GANs that we use to generate image content today basically model images as 2D grids of pixels and are pretty good at modeling sort of shape and texture in a 2D image plane, but don't have much knowledge of the 3D structure of the world, of the fact that all of our 2D images are in fact projections of a real, true 3D world. So what I think we should do is push 3D content, push content generation with deep neural networks from 2D to 3D. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And in particular, I want to talk about two types of content creation that involve 3D content. So the first is this task of 3D shape prediction, where we want to make some explicit 3D shape prediction about our input images. For example, we might want to input an image and then output the 3D shapes of all the objects in the image. And this sort of task might be useful for something like computer graphics, where we want to generate mesh assets to describe the 3D shapes of objects in the world, given just 2D input images. And now the second task is this idea of involves this idea of using implicit 3D, where we want to do some kind of fundamentally 2D generation task, in our case, novel view synthesis. But even though the task is to generate 2D image pixels, the way that we accomplish the task uses some kind of some implicit 3D representation that is aware of the 3D structure of the world. Now, one of the key challenges for any kind of 3D recognition or 3D generation task is what kind of supervision you're allowed to use. So most of our deep learning systems work quite well on using 2D supervision, and like bounding boxes, segmentation masks, and category labels. And 2D supervision is great because we know how to collect it with scalably on mechanical Turk. Now, the 3D supervision, on the other hand, is a lot trickier. If we want to get ground truth 3D shape or depth or camera pose, it's not so easy to ask people on mechanical Turk to label that sort of stuff for us. So I think that the solution here is to relax the constraint of requiring 3D supervision for our 3D generation tasks. And in particular, I think it's really important to develop methods that can make 3D predictions even when they're only having 2D supervision. And the technical tool that we'll use to do this is differentiable rendering. That's a quick introduction. And now an outline of the rest of the talk. First, I want to talk about our work on supervised 3D shape prediction that we presented at AICCW last year. Then we'll talk a bit about differential rendering, and then show how differential rendering can be used to do both unsupervised shape prediction, as well as this task of single image view synthesis with implicit 3D. We had this paper last year at AICCW where we called MeshRCNN, where the task is to input a single RGB image and output and detect all the objects in the image, and then produce the full 3D shape represented as a triangle mesh for all of the objects in the scene. So basically, given our input image, we want to produce a bounding box for each. Given an input image, we want to produce a bounding box, category label, and instance segmentation mask for each object. And this architecture is sort of the same as MaskRCNN. Now, the interesting part is we also want to predict a 3D triangle mesh for each of these objects. And for this, we develop a new mesh head architecture. And the challenge here is figuring out what sort of architecture of a neural network should you use if you want to generate 3D triangle meshes. So the basic idea we use for predicting triangle meshes from deep neural networks is this idea of iterative mesh refinement that we borrowed from this paper Pixel to Mesh that was published at AICCW 2018. And the idea here is that we're going to start with some initial mesh with some initial shape, often like a sphere or an ellipsoid. Then we'll have neural network modules that produce vertex offsets that can move around the vertices of this initial template mesh. And at each stage, we'll sort of move the vertices a little bit and produce a new output mesh. And after hopefully multiple stages of this sort of iterative refinement, then we'll end up producing a mesh which matches the shape that we wanted to predict. The problem here, of course, is that our predictions are constrained to match the mesh topology of our initial ellipsoid mesh. So this, in particular, means that if you start from a sphere or an ellipsoid, then we're never going to be able to predict a mesh which has like a hole in it. So the solution that we proposed in MeshRCNN was to actually use a hybrid shape representation and use not only meshes, but also an intermediate voxel representation. So the way that this works is that the MeshRCNN pipeline starts from an input image. And then from that input image, we first do 2D object recognition to find all the bounding boxes and category labels and segmentation masks using the same sort of architecture as MaskRCNN. And then from each of those detected 2D objects, we're going to make a coarse voxel prediction that predicts the coarse shape of all of those objects as voxels. And then given those coarse voxel predictions, we'll sort of meshify the coarse voxel predictions to give some initial 3D mesh for each of the objects. And then those initial 3D meshes will be refined using this idea of iterative mesh refinement that will then predict a really high quality mesh for each of our objects in the scene. Now we did some some quantitative results on the ShapeNet data set that show that this hybrid shape representation allows us to outperform prior work on this task of a single image shape prediction. But what's interesting, what I think is more interesting to look at here are the qualitative results. So you can see that here, these results at the bottom, our model is able to take a single RGB image as input and now predict these fairly high quality 3D triangle meshes that give the shapes of the objects. And we can capture even relatively fine structures like the thin legs of the chair on the left, or this very fine structure around the base of the table on the far right. We can also do this on this Pix3D dataset, where we do both joint object detection and shape prediction. And again, we can produce high quality 3D shapes from 2D images. Some interesting things to note here are that because we're sort of built on this framework of object detection, we can predict many objects per scene. Like in this example, we can predict the chair and the tables and the couch all with a single forward pass to the model. We can sort of predict occluded parts of the object, like we can predict the 3D shape of the chair, even for the region of the image where it's occluded by the dog's head. Another interesting thing to point out is that failures in 2D recognition often propagate to failures in 3D shape prediction. So here in the bookcase on the left, we can see the instance segmentation mask misses some parts of the bookcase, and those same parts of the bookcase are missing in the 3D triangle mesh that we predict. So this gives us some hope that maybe improvements in 2D recognition could also lead to downstream improvements in this 3D shape prediction task. So this was our quick overview of our work on supervised 3D shape prediction. And the takeaway here is basically when you have supervision for 3D shapes, we can now train models that are able to predict relatively high quality 3D triangle meshes, assuming this sort of 3D supervision. But of course, the big problem here is that we use 3D supervision, and this 3D supervision is very expensive to obtain. So the basic pipeline in MeshRCNN is that we've got our input model. Our model makes some 3D predictions, and we compare our predicted 3D shapes with some ground truth 3D shapes, and that gives us our loss. Then we backpropagate that loss to update the model, and just like we do in all deep learning pipelines. But what we'd like to do is somehow get away from this constraint of requiring 3D ground truth supervision in order to make predictions about triangle meshes. So here, one idea that we can try to use is this idea of render and compare, or analysis by synthesis, that might enable us to train 3D shape predictions using only 2D supervision and using only 2D loss functions. So the way that this might work is from our input image on the left, we might pass our input image through a model. This model can make some 3D predictions about the scene, giving some 3D shape and other 3D properties. Then from those 3D predictions, we can render them to get now a 2-dimensional image or a 2-dimensional projection of the model's 3-dimensional predictions. Then we can compare this 2-dimensional projection with some kind of ground truth 2D image or 2D supervision, and now apply a loss function in 2D rather than in 3D. And now, hopefully we can backpropagate through everything and eventually use this 2-dimensional supervision to train the 3D predictions from our model. But now the problem here is that we need to backpropagate through the rendering process, which is a little bit non-trivial. That gives us this idea, that leads to this idea of differential rendering. So a differential render is basically a renderer through which you can compute derivatives. So in a traditional renderer in graphics, it sort of starts from some scene properties like the 3D shape, camera, the textures, whatever else, sort of 3-dimensional scene properties. Those pass through a rendering engine and then give rise to some rendered 2D RGB image. And now if this thing is embedded in a deep learning system, then that image can go off into some other part of the system and be used to compute a loss. Then during the backward pass, we'll receive from upstream the gradient of the loss with respect to our produced 2D image. And then we want to be able to backpropagate this gradient through the rendering engine and compute derivatives of the loss with respect to all the input scene properties. And if we can do this, then we'll be able to embed this rendering engine as a layer inside of our larger neural network systems. So to see how this works, we need to back up and remember a little bit how traditional rendering works, like sort of a graphics 101 picture rendering. So rendering basically consists of sort of two major steps. The idea is we've got some set of primitives, 3D primitives, often triangles out in the scene, out in 3D space. And the first step is rasterization. So rasterization is we want to project those 3D primitives onto the 2D image plane and determine for each pixel in the image that we're going to generate, which of 3D primitive is covering that pixel. And then the second step is shading. And shading is going to say we're going to compute the color of each pixel based on which 3D primitives are hitting that pixel. And now within these two steps, shading is sort of naturally differentiable. Because the way that we do shading is we usually interpolate some kind of vertex data, like colors or normals or depth or whatever, and we have access to that data at the vertices, and we want to interpolate it over the interior of the triangle. And this sort of interpolation is naturally differentiable. So shading is sort of a naturally differentiable operation, even in a lot of traditional rendering pipelines. Rasterization, however, is non-differentiable due to boundary effects and occlusion effects. So to see why traditional rasterization is non-differentiable, we can imagine what happens if we zoom in on just one pixel of our rendered image. So here we're looking at one pixel, and we imagine what's going to happen to the color of this pixel as we change the x coordinate of the blue face. Well, the assumption is that in sort of a traditional rasterizer, each pixel is going to be, the color of the pixel is going to depend only on the nearest face to that pixel in the z direction. So as we move move that blue face in the xy plane, then once the blue face moves out from the green pixel, then the color of that pixel will change sharply from blue to orange for the next face behind it. And that leads to this non-differentiable step function where we plot the pixel color as a function of the x coordinate of the blue face. And this non-differentiability means that we can't back propagate through traditional rasterization. And there's a similar non-differentiability due to as we move in the z direction. So here, if we imagine we move the position of the blue face along the z-axis, then at the point where the blue face and the orange face sort of pass through each other, then again the color of that highlighted green pixel will change sharply from blue to orange. And this again gives us a sort of non-differentiable step function that we can't back through. So that's sort of the two reasons why traditional rasterization and more broadly traditional rendering pipelines are non-differentiable. Now, there's been a lot of work in the last few years on ways to solve this non-differentiability problem and propose alternatives to traditional rasterization that leads to differentiable outputs. So one really nice solution that we liked that was published at AICCW last year is this project called Soft Rasterizer. And they have a pretty nice, elegant way to smoothing out the non-differentiabilities in traditional rasterization. So the way that they do it is first, they'll make all the triangles semi-transparent and have the transparency of the triangle increase as we move toward the boundary of the triangle. And then second, rather than having each pixel depend only on its nearest triangle in along the z direction, instead they blend the colors of multiple triangles along the z direction. And once you make these two changes, this smooths out these two non-differentiabilities that we had seen in the traditional rasterization process. So we really liked this idea, but we wanted but we weren't so happy with the implementation of the soft rasterizer implementation. So we built our own implementation of a differential renderer that's more industrial scale and high quality and going to be maintained over time. And that's a key component of this PyTorch 3D library that we've been working on at FAIR. So the PyTorch 3D renderer, the PyTorch 3D, one of its key features is a differential mesh renderer that's largely inspired by soft rasterizer. But we make 4 critical changes to the rendering pipeline compared to soft rasterizer that leads to some big improvements. So especially improvements around efficiency and modularity. So the first change is that soft rasterizer colors each pixel depending on all faces along the z-axis that intersect the pixel. Whereas in our renderer, for efficiency purposes, we have the color of each pixel depend only on the k nearest neighboring faces along the z direction. This means we need to do less computation for each pixel and leads to efficiency gains. Second, we use a coarse-to-fine rasterization strategy. So the soft rasterizer implementation uses a kind of naive approach of checking for each pixel for every face, do some calculation. And in ours, we use a kind of coarse define, where we first divide up the image into tiles, do computation at the tile level before dropping to computation at the individual pixels. So this is sort of produces the same results, but is a more algorithmically efficient way to do it. The third change is that we move a lot of the logic from CUDA to PyTorch, and this improves modularity. So in soft rasterizer, this whole pipeline of rasterization and shading is one giant monolithic CUDA kernel. And that makes it pretty difficult to change around the guts or the particulars of the rendering pipeline, and makes it hard to customize. So in PyTorch 3D, we separate this out and we use a modular implementation, where rasterization is implemented with a custom CUDA kernel, and shading is all implemented in PyTorch. And this is really nice because it lets you easily write new shaders to extend the basic rendering engine. So as an example, we can sort of write a shader which does differentiable silhouette rendering using just two simple lines of PyTorch and compute all the gradients using auto differentiation. So this makes our renderer much more modular and extensible compared to this prior implementation from soft rasterizer. And the fourth change, is a little bit technical, is that we have support for heterogeneous batches of meshes. So what do I mean by heterogeneous? I mean that we can support batches of triangle meshes where each element in the batch has different numbers of vertices and faces. And this allows for a lot more flexibility in the types of data that we can efficiently render. So once we combine all these improvements together, we see that we actually get a pretty huge efficiency gain over soft rasterizer. So here on the x-axis, we're plotting, we're doing differentiable rendering, textured differentiable rendering of a batch of triangle meshes. Along the x-axis, we increase the mean mesh size of meshes in our batch. And the y-axis shows the forward backward time of the entire rendering pipeline. And you can see that through these efficiency improvements, our renderer is up to 5x faster than soft rasterizer for very large triangle meshes. As a slight caveat, because of our modular design, we actually use a bit more memory, but we think that this slightly higher memory usage is a good trade-off given our overall speed improvements. So now that we've got this tool of differentiable rendering, one really cool application that we can use it for is doing unsupervised 3D shape prediction. So in MeshRCNN, we saw that we could make high-quality mesh predictions when we have access to ground truth 3D shapes. But now that we have this tool of differentiable rendering, we'll be able to make 3D shape predictions using no 3D ground truth shape data. So the way that this works is we'll have our input image. It goes through some kind of image encoder and shape network that produces a predicted 3D shape. Then given the predicted 3D shape, we'll pass it through a differentiable silhouette renderer to give a predicted silhouette of the 3D shape in the view frame of the input image. Then we'll compare this silhouette with a ground truth silhouette, which is a form of two-dimensional supervision. And this will give us a two-dimensional loss between the prediction and the true silhouette that we can backpropagate into the 3D shape network. Of course, there's a problem, is that predicting 3D shapes from only a single viewpoint information is ambiguous. So in practice, we actually use two-view supervision. So after we predict our 3D shape, we rotate it and translate it according to some known 3D transformation, then also render the rotated shape from the second viewpoint, again, using our differentiable silhouette renderer, and compare this predicted silhouette from the second view with a ground truth silhouette of the shape from a second view. This means that our supervision during training is an image, a pair of 2D silhouettes of the object, and a known relative camera pose between those 2D silhouettes. And with only this 2D supervision, using our differentiable renderer, we're now able to train a model to make 3D shape predictions. So we use sort of two different architectures for 3D shape prediction. One is sort of similar to prior work called SteerFC that uses fully connected layers to regress offsets from an initial sphere template mesh. And the second is a bit more sophisticated and really follows the architecture that we used for MeshRCNN that computes image-aligned features for every vertex in the mesh, and then uses graph convolution to make its predictions rather than fully connected layers. And this makes the architecture more aligned to the input image and makes the architecture of the neural respect the 3D structure of the mesh that it's predicting. So we want to make two comparisons in this model. One is we can show that our Sphere GCN model outperforms Sphere FC for this task of unsupervised shape prediction. And second, we show that the PyTorch 3D renderer outperforms this soft dress renderer, or at least gives comparable results. But what's really interesting is that because our renderer is so efficient and so scalable, we can actually improve the results across the board by simply scaling everything up without making any algorithmic changes, just using higher resolution images and high resolution meshes. So simply by taking the exact same model and moving to higher resolution silhouette images, then we improve the 3D shape predictions in system. And we can also just similarly just scale up the size of the mesh that we predict. And because of the scalability and efficiency of the PyTorch 3D renderer, we can make predictions of larger meshes with more vertices and more faces. And this again gives us some performance improvements basically for free. So now what's really cool is looking at the qualitative results here. So here are some results of our unsupervised 3D shape prediction, where on the left is showing the input image, and then we're showing the 3D mesh predictions of our SteerFC and SteerGCN models that actually make very high quality 3D shape predictions using no 3D shape supervision whatsoever. And we can push this to our higher resolution SteerGCN model. And again, it just sort of gives very qualitatively good mesh predictions, even though we have no 3D mesh supervision whatsoever. So far we've talked about this in the context of silhouette rendering. We can also trivially extend the model to do textured mesh rendering, where we compare not silhouettes, but RGB images. And we extend the model to predict a color per vertex, and then interpolate that color per vertex over the faces using different sorts of shading models. So this also allows us to predict textured 3D meshes from single RGB images using, again, no 3D supervision whatsoever. We can also use a similar approach to predict not meshes, but instead predict point clouds, where we predict a collection of points, each point with an RGB color from a single input image, and again, train this whole point cloud prediction system using our differentiable renderer without relying on any 3D supervision whatsoever. That gives us our first task of unsupervised shape prediction. And then the final task I want to talk about is this idea of single image view synthesis. And this is a paper that was led by Olivia Wiles during internship at FAIR last summer, and also with Georgia and Rick from Facebook. And this is being presented at this CVPR. So here we want to attack this problem of single image view synthesis. So given an input RGB image, we want to imagine what the scene would look like from a slightly different viewpoint. Like maybe if we stepped a little bit forward and moved a little bit to the left. And this is fundamentally a 2D prediction problem, right? Because we've got our input is a 2D image, our output is a 2D image, but somehow, so this is fundamentally a 2D problem. But this 2D prediction problem requires some understanding of the 3D nature of the world. For example, we need to be able to know that the bushes are closer to the camera than these trees in purple, so that they can properly transform in the image plane as we make our view transform. This problem is also challenging due to inpainting. So in the second view, we might need to inpaint or invent new pixels to give plausible completions of objects that were occluded in the input frame. So our goal in this project is to work really on complex realistic scenes. In the sort of experiments that we've seen in MeshRCNN and ShapeNet so far, we were mostly working on individual objects. And in this SynSyn project, we really wanted to push this idea of 3D shape prediction to more complex realistic whole scenes, not individual objects. Second, we want to train only using 2D supervision for the reasons that we discussed earlier. And at test time, we want to use only a single RGB image as input. And finally, we want to train the whole system end to end. So the way that this works is we're going to make these 2D predictions, but using an intermediate latent point cloud of 3D features. So the way that this works is that we'll take our input image, pass it through some feature prediction network to get per pixel features, then also pass the image through a depth prediction network to get per pixel depth predictions. And now for every pixel in the input image, we've got a feature vector and we've got a depth. So we can then project those feature vectors out into 3D to now get a point cloud of feature vectors that is used to represent the input 3D scene. Then we can rotate the camera and then differentially project those point cloud of 3D features onto the second view using our differentiable point cloud renderer from PyTorch 3D. Then we can take those, and that gives us a projected tensor of features that shows like what do the features of this scene look like from this secondary viewpoint. We can take those projected features, run them through a decoder network to produce our final 2D generated image. which we then train by passing to a discriminator that checks that makes real fake discriminations, as well as compare with a ground truth to the image using L2 and perceptual losses. And note that this whole model receives only 2D supervision. The supervision that we get during training time are the input image in green, the target output image in blue, and the relative camera pose of those two images in purple. But in particular, the 3D structure of the point cloud that we predict is completely unsupervised. Now we test this thing on some real world data sets, these room scale data sets of Matterport 3D, as well as Real Estate 10K, which gives us realistic videos where we get access to camera poses due to SFM. Now the qualitative results here are pretty fun. So here's an input image from the Real Estate 10K data set. And then here's the ground truth of what it looks like as we move through the scene in ground truth. And now our prediction, and then here we're showing predictions from our model, where we're using our view synthesis model to generate predicted views, of giving us a sort of virtual 3D walkthrough of this scene, using only a single RGB image, using only the image on the left as input. And we can see that the model sort of transforms the wall and the couch in plausible ways according to the 3D structure of the scene. And also gives sort of plausible completions toward the boundary of the scene. And it in particular is able to produce the kind of in-painting results where we extend the banister or the handrail on the left-hand side of the scene. This works for more complicated scenes, and again, we're able to properly model the 3D structure of the world with our view synthesis results, even though we receive only 2D supervision during training. And our models work not only on these indoor scenes, but can also give pretty plausible view synthesis results also for outdoor scenes, like this with pretty complicated structure, like all these trees on a path. We can also gain some insight into the predictions of our model by visualizing the intermediate point cloud that it predicts for input images. And we can see by kind of rotating around the predicted point cloud that the model was able to properly capture some pretty correct 3D structure of the scene, even though it received only 2D supervision during training. Now, this model is also able to do some zero-shot generalization. So we can train on the Matterport data set and then do zero-shot generalization at test time to this replica data set and get pretty good results. We can also do a zero-shot generalization to higher image resolutions. So because the model is sort of fully convolutional, we can train it at 256 by 256 images, and then at test time do zero-shot generalization to higher resolution 512 by 512 images and get pretty reasonable results. So then here, so this is kind of this has been our summary of some of our recent work on predicting content with deep neural networks using 3D aware predictions. So we saw this task of 3D shape prediction, where we're making explicit 3D predictions, and we saw that can be done using 3D supervision. And then by using differential rendering, we can relax that supervision restriction and now predict 3D shapes of objects using only 2D supervision. And then similarly, we saw that this same idea of differential rendering can let us train these really high quality single image view synthesis models that are able to predict novel views of scenes and properly model the 3D structure of those scenes, even though they're trained only with 2D supervision during training time, and instead make use of an implicit 3D representation. So in general, I think that this is a pretty exciting direction, and I look forward to continuing finding ways to thread 3D understanding into our content generation models to see what kind of cool advances that can lead us towards content creation with deep neural networks. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions later on during the Q&A session.
Okay. So in light of the time, I don't think we have time for live question, but I think Justin might be in the room, so you can ask him. So let's move on to the next poster session, poster and oral paper session. So let me present. I think Deqing didn't show this slide. So one thing you need to know is we have a best paper and best paper runner-up award. So there's also a very new award. You can pick your best paper presentation. You can use this short URL to vote. I'll post the link in the group chat later. So right now so we compiled all the video and we can play all the video, but if you have question, you can After you're watching the video, you can go to each individual room and talk to the author for the QA session. So let me play the morning session. So basically, the video gonna be about 20, less than 30 minutes. So you still have 20, 30 minutes to ask questions if you want after the video. Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Tristan Sylvain, and I'll be presenting object-centric image generation from layouts. First of all, I'll talk about the motivations for this work. The first motivation was to generate realistic scenes with well-defined objects. On the left-hand side, you can see outputs of our model and different baselines with fixed layouts. As you can see, in many cases, while the model will generate an image that looks quite well overall, sometimes individual objects or parts of the scene do not look correct. Sometimes, for example, as you can see for the animals on row D, you have a scenery that looks quite okay, but the animals themselves are merged or blurry or not defined. Also, sometimes the objects themselves are not completely well defined, especially if they occupy a small area. To illustrate this point, we started with donuts on the edges of each layout, and we made them gradually converge to the center. As you can see, our method maintains separate donuts, whereas most of the other baselines tend to form a garbled image at the center, which does not really represent what the donut should be. This was our first motivation. Our second motivation was generated scenes that actually correctly match the layout. So to illustrate this, another figure taken from the paper. As you can see, for the baselines we're looking at, they often generate realistic scenes here, but scenes that don't actually match the input layout. As you can see, there are many more people in both cases than there are supposed to be given the layout. Common issues which lead to what we call low layout fidelity. You might have spurious or missing objects, you might have merged objects, or you might have objects that are unidentifiable. So this is also a major issue. Now I'll talk briefly about the components of our approach. First of all, we use a scene graph similarity module. This is a retrieval-based module that encourages the generated scene to closely match the input layout. This works by essentially taking the layout, turning it into a scene graph, using a GCN to embed it, and then applying global loss with respect to global and local image features. This SGSM module, by the fact that it acts as a retrieval-based module, strongly encourages the generated scenes to correctly match the input layout. Here is the full architecture diagram. I'll go over some of the components briefly. As you can see, we have layout, which is fed as a condition to the batch norm. Layout is also used to generate a scene graph, which is then fed to a GCN, which will allow us to compute the SGSM. In addition to this, we use a perceptual loss and an instance prior, which is simply taking the bounding box to generate contours, which are actually the contours of the bounding boxes of each object. This helps object quality a little bit. Now, I'll talk briefly about the results. First of all, quantitative results. We use the classical inception score, FID, and classifier accuracy score that are commonly used in the literature. And as you can see, we generate a large improvement over the baselines for each of these metrics. These are results in 128 by 128, but results in 64 by 64 are similar. So overall, we improve on the baselines a lot. In particular, CES scores are strongly improved, which is an indication of the fact that we're generating very realistic objects according to this metric. Qualitative results. So as you can see here, these are generated images that are taken at random. And while many of the baselines introduce spurious objects, overall, we tend to match the input layout very well. And this has been confirmed by manual evaluation by many researchers at random. So the user study confirms what I was saying. People judge our images to have significantly higher layout fidelity. So thank you for listening to this presentation. Please reach out to me if you have any questions about this work. Our workshop paper is hosted on the workshop website, and in addition, you can find the full paper at arXiv on the given link. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Yu Chuan. I'm working at PAI Labs. Today I'm going to talk about our research work named SEG-Tengen, text-to-image generation with segmentation attention. So the task of text-to-image synthesis is central to many applications. A lot of research use generative models to achieve satisfactory visual quality. However, these models would frequently generate objects with deformed shapes or unrealistic layouts. To solve this problem, we designed SEG-Tengen, which utilizes segmentation information to add spatial attention. We hope that the spatial attention would regulate the layout of generated images. An experiment has shown promising results. A Tengen is one of the state-of-the-art text-to-image GAN model. This GAN is conditioned on text input rather than noise. The model used coarse-to-fine strategy for the GAN training to get better image quality. Also, this model is conditioned on both sentence level and word level features. So based on a Tengen work, we proposed a model that takes text description as well as segmentation mask as input. This model used segmentation to do the spatial attention after each upsample layer in generator. We also proposed a self-attention strategy. We use coarse-to-fine architecture for the better image results. Other parts like text encoder, word features, and sentence features are inherited from the Tengen model. Now we introduce the details of the segmentation attention module. When giving a segmentation mask, we pass it to a couple of convolutional layers to produce the segmentation features. Then we do the element-wise multiplication and addition to the previous layer of the image features. This method is related to many work like Spade or Eden. For self-attention, we will train another generator for the segmentation mask, and the model can use generated segmentation to do the spatial constraint. This method avoids using the real segmentation data during the inference phase. In Generative Adversarial Network, the classic objective function is a min-maxing between the generator and discriminator. Our model basically is a GAN, which generator is conditioned on text description as well as segmentation, and the discriminator is conditioned on the text description. And our total loss is consist of image generator loss, segmentation generator loss, and text image matching loss, which is introduced in a Tengen. We use 2 datasets and 2 quantitative measurements to evaluate our model. Inception score has been widely used to evaluate the quality of generated images, and our precision score is a method to determine whether the generated images is well conditioned on the given text description. Our model achieves highest inception scores on both CUB and Oxford datasets, and our self-attention model also gets a pretty good inception score. We applied our segmentation attention module on STAT-GAN and get better inception scores. This indicates that our model can help constrain the training of different GAN models. As shown in this figure, compared to the baseline model, our model can generate results with better object shapes. Although self-attention model use fixed segmentation, it is able to constrain the object shapes and generate better images than the baseline model. This figure shows image samples comparing to the segmentation mask. We can know that in our model, the segmentation provides very good control on the object shapes. Thank you for listening.
Hello, I am Junbom Cha from Naver Global AI Research. I'll introduce our work toward high-quality feature font generation with dual memory. Here, we aim to generate a high-quality font library with only a few style samples. There exists some prior works for the feature font generation task, but they often fail to capture detailed styles as shown in this figure. In this work, we solve the problem by exploiting the characteristics of scripts compositionality. We focus on a famous family of scripts called compositional scripts, which are composed of a combination of subglyphs or components. For example, every Korean letter can be decomposed into 3 components. Here, we focus on the Korean scripts only, but our method is applicable to the most of compositional scripts. Also, the most of compositional scripts have glyph-rich property. For example, Chinese script has more than 50,000 glyphs, and Korean script has 11,172 glyphs. Therefore, we need an automatic font generation method for the compositional scripts. This is the conceptual architecture of our model. The model is composed of encoder, decoder, and memory. Given reference style glyphs are encoded to the component-wise features by encoder. During training, the encoder learns how to decompose the glyphs to the components. The encoded features are written to the dynamic memory. In the conceptual figure, the encoded feature can be directly fed to the decoder without the memory. But in the test scenario, the target glyph is unknown in the reference type glyphs. So we need the dynamic memory to connect the encoder with the decoder. The decoder loads features from the memory and synthesizes the target glyphs. During training, decoder learns how to combine the component-wise features. Finally, we introduce one more module, persistent memory. It is learned embedding, which learns the global composition information and the intrinsic shape of each component. This memory is trained independent to the font style. This is the full architecture of dual memory font generation network. The generation process is composed of encoding and decoding stages. In the encoding stage, the reference style glyphs are encoded to the component features and stored into the dynamic memory. After the encoder fills up the memory, the decoder fetches the component features from the memories and synthesizes the target glyph. Let's see the experimental results. This is the visual comparison on the Korean handwriting dataset. Previous methods generate the contents of glyphs and capture global styles well, but the detailed local styles look different from the ground truth. For better comparison, we highlight the sum of detailed local styles in the last row. To quantitatively evaluate the model more closely to the human perception, we train content classifier and style classifier. Using the classifiers, we measure the classification accuracy and MFID of the synthesized glyphs. As shown in the table, DM font scores the best in all measures. AICCW shows similar results in the content score, but our model dominates the stylization performance. We also conduct the user study using the real handwriting glyphs. This dataset is more unrefined and noisy than validation dataset. In the user study, we investigate the content, style, and overall preference. Similar to the quantitative evaluation results, AICCW and DM fonts are comparable in the content evaluation, and our method is dominant in the style preference. To sum up, we proposed a novel feature font generation model, and it improves the generation quality remarkably, especially in the detailed stylization. In this presentation, we omit and abstract a lot of details of our work, so please check our paper for the details. In addition to the workshop paper, recently we released the extended version to the archive. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, I'm Samuel Mo from Kite, and I'll introduce our work briefly for fine-tuning GANs. Modern GANs show remarkable success in image generation, but they require lots of training data and computational resources. Several works propose a transfer learning approach, but they are often prone to overfitting or limited to learnings for distribution shift. We find that simply freezing the lower layers of the discriminator while fine-tuning GANs, surprisingly outperforms the prior methods. In particular, freeze-D shows more stable and better results than the vanilla fine-tuning. Freeze-D consistently outperforms fine-tuning under various datasets. Also, freeze-D generates more less consistent samples. We compare freeze-D with various prior methods and do an ablation study on freezing layers. We hope freeze-D set a proper baseline for future researches on transfer learning of GANs. Please check our paper for more details. Thanks.
In this work, we present mix and match, which disentangles, encodes, and combines background, shape, texture, and pose from real images to generate a new image. Our model does this without any mask or label annotations. Our model consists of 4 encoders to disentangle and encode different factors from real images, and a fine-grained generator to generate new images conditioned on the latent codes. We use adversarial learning to match the paired image code distributions between the encoder and the generator. With mix and match, we can colorize cartoons or sketch images where we take the background and foreground color from different real images. We can also animate objects by taking the pose from a reference video clip. Our code and web demo are available on the GitHub link.
Proposed interface GAN. With interface GAN, we can interpret the face semantics learned by GANs, disentangle various semantics, and further reuse these semantics for base editing. Interface GAN consists of 3 steps. Step 1, synthesize images with randomly sampled latent codes. Step 2, assign semantic labels to synthesize the images, like male versus female. Step 3, train a linear boundary in the latent space by using semantic labels as ground truths. By moving latent codes towards the boundary, we can achieve semantic face editing. With interface GAN, we can edit facial attributes, vary the face pose, or even fix the artifacts generated by GANs. We also propose a technique to disentangle different semantics, which we call conditional manipulation. With conditional manipulation, we manage to only change the wanted attribute without affecting the other.
Hello everyone, I will introduce our semantic hierarchy emerges in deep generative representations for scene synthesis. In this work, we propose an effective framework, termed as HEGAN, to interpret the semantics learned for scene synthesis. Our framework consists of 3 steps. The first one is to build the image and semantic spaces via the generative models and off-the-shelf classifiers. The boundaries of semantics are identified by probing in the latent space. Finally, verification allows to quantify the causality between activations and semantics. It turns out that generative models which employ layer-wise latent codes could encode semantics from different abstraction levels in a hierarchical manner. Specifically, the bottom layers tend to determine the spatial layout, the lower layers control the categorical objects, the later layers finally render the scene attributes as well as the color scheme. Identifying such variation factors enables semantic scene manipulation. Thanks.
Image to style GAN++. Here we show some of the applications of our framework. First one is image in painting. The algorithm is able to fill photorealistic details to the defective area. We also show different solutions generated by our algorithm. Here we show our method outperforms other methods across all the metrics. Next, we show local edits using scribbles. Here, a scribbled image is converted into semantically meaningful edit of high perceptual quality. We are able to perform various local edits to different images. Face manipulation is yet another application of image to style GAN++. Here we do attribute level feature transfer from one image to another according to the copy mask. Here, the beds are modified according to the attribute image. Thank you for watching.
In this video, we present Sean, a simple but effective building block that enables per-region style control for GANs conditioned on segmentation masks. Image-to-image translation is an umbrella concept that can be used to describe many problems in computer vision and computer graphics. Among them, semantic image synthesis is particularly useful as it enables easy user control by modifying the input semantic layout image. To date, the best architecture is SPADE. In a nutshell, SPADE synthesizes an image by two inputs. First, a style code extracted by an image encoder or sampled from a noise distribution. Second, a segmentation mask that is used to modulate the scales and biases of the generator activations. However, by analyzing SPADE results, we found two shortcomings that we would like to improve upon. First, SPADE uses only one style code to control the entire style of an image, which is not sufficient for high-quality synthesis or detailed control. Second, inserting style information only in the beginning of a network is not a good architecture choice. Correspondingly, we propose two modifications on SPADE. First, use one style code per region rather than one style code per image. Second, inject style information at multiple locations in the architecture instead of only at the beginning. To implement these ideas, we propose Sean, a normalization layer that modulates the scales and biases of the generator activations by both the per-region style code matrix ST and segmentation mask M. In more detail, the style code matrix ST undergoes a per-style convolution, and the style codes are then broadcast to their corresponding regions according to M to yield a style map. Both the style map and segmentation mask will be passed through separate convolutional layers to generate the modulation parameters. We model the network training as reconstructing the input image by its corresponding segmentation mask and the extracted per-region style codes. During inference, our model allows highly flexible image synthesis by using an arbitrary segmentation mask and selecting separate style codes for each semantic region. Here is an example of our phased image editing results. By controlling the style code of the corresponding semantic regions, we can edit the hair, mouth and eyes, skin tone, and background of the input image, respectively. Compared with SPADE, our method is better suited to encode, transfer, and synthesize style in terms of reconstruction quality, variability, and visual quality. Now we show a sequence of style interpolation results with fixed layouts. Finally, we will introduce our user interface for face editing. To the left, we show the current style image from which we extract per-region style codes. In the middle, we show the current segmentation mask. To the right, we show the current result. Here, we show editing results, where all style codes are obtained from a single style image. Note how our method can capture the essence of elements such as hairstyle, skin tone, background, and eyes in a per-region style code and transfer it to a face segmentation mask with very different region shapes. The following is an editing sequence where style codes are selected from different images. For example, we can change the hairstyle, the eyes, the mouth, background, and clothing. We can also modify the final result by painting changes to the segmentation mask. For example, we can extend the hair region to the right, and then paint hair bangs on the forehead. Our code is available on GitHub. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so I think this will conclude the whole morning session. So if you have questions, could you please plan our schedule? For each paper, we have an individual chat room, so you can ask questions directly to the author. And here I want to also remind you, we have I'm going to post this link to the group chat, so you can vote your best paper by filling out this form. Okay, thanks everyone for attending the workshop.
Yeah, so we'll see you all in this Zoom link at 2 p.m. where Samia will first give the keynote talk and followed by Aaron, In, and Misha.